We got Mac and Mac, McMullen McDonald here with you on Bird 365. We are honored to have our next guest on, one of the best football writers, at least my opinion, in the country, has been for years, an NFL historian, Russell Baxter. And sometimes, Johnny Mac, things work out. I had already reached out to Russell and said, would he come on Monday, before we found out that Jim Brown had passed away during the weekend. You got three guys of relative same age here. And I think I'm the oldest of the bunch, not by much, but a little older. And I didn't see Jim Brown play. He retired in the mid-'60s. I didn't start watching football until the late 60s. But we all know of his accomplishments and how great a player he was. Russell, you've been hanging with guys who certainly had the chance to watch football in the 60s. What kind of reverence do they speak of Jim Brown with?
Well, first of all, good morning, guys. It's great to see you again. We haven't done this in a couple of months. My good friend, as you know, Tom Jackson, born in Cleveland, talked about Jim Brown a lot. I think it was his father's favorite player, as a matter of fact. Every time you see a highlight of him, you see something different, and it just blows you away. I think the things that, Earl Campbell was like this. Big, but deceptively fast. So when I watch Jim Brown have like five guys have an angle on him and he just zips past them up the middle of the field, it was more than just a guy who knocked people over. His balance was unbelievable. The production, he played 9 years. He was, I think, named to the Pro Bowl every year, led the league in rushing as a rookie, not with 1,000 yards, by the way. Okay. He played a lot of 12-game seasons. I think he had 1,800 yards one year. And think about that now, okay, in a 17-game season. I think my favorite stat is for his entire career, guys. He averaged 104.3 yards per game rushing for his career. He had more total touchdowns, 126, than games played, 118. Okay, because he could catch the ball as well. But the sheer power and speed combination, he was just, in 1965, it was his final year.
Yeah.
He still ranks 11th all-time in rushing with 12,312 yards. Yeah. That was the mark. That was one of those numbers, like Babe Ruth, 714.
Yeah, it's
Chris Berman used to talk about that. That was the number that Walter Payton broke in 1984, the 12,312, but it still ranks 11th all time. I got to see him. I never spoke to him. I got to see him at the Hall of Fame when he came, when they brought a lot of people back and so on. You could see the last couple of years he was starting to, it was tough for, I want to say the last 2 years I was there, he was unable to come up to the stage. And that's, they have the guys come in with their gold jackets and all come up and so on. And you see that as time wears on, some of the older players and even some of the older coaches, tough. But he is still the guy. And I think I wrote this in my fan-sided piece. He was the GOAT before we started naming goats. Okay.
Yeah.
He was. He wasn't a goat. He was a ram. Okay,
that's true.
And I don't mean Los Angeles. Okay, but like I said, the combination, the size, the speed. We know it's fabled accomplishments as a lacrosse player as well. When you say Jim Brown, everybody likes to do debates. Who's the best? This, who's best? Who's this? I can't think of one single list of running backs that doesn't include him. Not one. Some people don't put on Emmett. Some people don't put on Barry. Some people don't put on, different guys for different reasons. Barry would have been great behind the Cowboys offensive line. Emmett wouldn't have been as good without that offensive line. Yeah, everybody, seemingly there's a lot of excuses made for players on different lists. There are no excuses, and there were no excuses for Jim Brown.
Yeah. You mentioned made the Pro Bowl. He was all pro, I believe, eight of those 9 years. And by the way, his crappy year, he was second team all pro.
Right.
So it was really 9 out of 9.
Well, and John, if that was on TV today, they would say, "What's wrong with Jim Brown?"
Yeah, he's losing it.
That would have been that would have been like a 10-minute segment. What's wrong with Jim Brown?
Of course. His final season, he was the MVP. He walked away. So people remember Barry Sanders walking away at the top of his game.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody walked away at the top of their game more than Jim Brown. He's one of those names. Because baseball was America's pastime, back in the Babe Ruth days, I think Babe Ruth has become this mythical figure almost, deservedly so. I think Jim Brown's the Babe Ruth of football, of NFL football. I think that's who he is. A legend, arguably the greatest football player of all time. You mentioned that, Russell. I've never heard anybody, there's contrarians all over the place who say, but never get a but with Jim Brown. Not one. Not one in my entire 20 plus years coming to this league. Nobody said, but about Jim Brown. No, they just said, Jim Brown.
Jim Brown, there is a reverence to his game. And again, as you alluded to, not only the greatest running back, but always in the discussion for the greatest football player as well. Yeah. And, those are two totally different things. I don't think sometimes we put enough emphasis on greatest football player, but you could imagine he could do just about anything he wanted. He was 6'2", 230 back in the late 50s, early 60s. He'd make a hell of an inside linebacker right now.
Yeah. Well, supposedly you mentioned lacrosse. Supposedly he's better at lacrosse than football. I some of these stories, get maybe embellished a little bit, but a phenomenal athlete. You mentioned the highlights because I'm with you, Russell. I love watching Earl Campbell highlights. I just love them. There's something about that guy. And that's Jim Brown, the same thing. There's something about that guy who's just, and when he retired, you probably know this. I forget who was number 2. What was the gap between number 1 and number 2? It was huge.
Oh, it was huge.
Yeah,
it was huge. I'm trying to think. Walter didn't come into the league until 1975.
Yeah.
I don't even know
5,000 yards. It was something.
Yeah, I don't even think there was anybody with close to 10,000. Now we have a bunch of guys who have 10,000 yards and so on. Yeah. You're right. I would have to think about that.
Could it be Marion Motley?
Well, Marion Motley got a bunch of his yards in the AAFC.
Oh, that didn't count.
And remember, the NFL doesn't count. The Pro Football Hall of Fame counts the AAFC. The NFL doesn't count the AAFC. The NFL counts the AFL. That was part of the merger agreement. All AFL records became NFL records. Trying to think.
Might have been Taylor.
And I'm doing a bunch of pieces. I'm doing a bunch of historical pieces I'm doing on right now. I've got a little theme thing going about guys ahead of their era and stuff like that. You'll see that over the next week and so on. But I think you're right, John. I think there was an enormous gap.
It might have been Jim Taylor. For some reason,
Jim Taylor, I want to say, had about 8,800 yards.
It might have been Jim. Might have been Jim.
Yeah, but didn't he retire after? Didn't he get those yards after Brown and Taylor played into the 70s, didn't he?
Oh, that's true too.
That's true too. Yeah. And, you're right.
Jim Brown was wrapped up by 65.
65.
I want to share with you guys it's funny what you remember, a great Jim Brown story. Growing up, we used to watch a lot of football with my dad. Even though he's a baseball guy, he loved football, and I loved spending Sunday afternoon sitting with him and watching him. And we'd see a game, and a guy would run, and he seemed to get hurt on the play. And he'd get up slowly from the tackle, and he'd just kind of meander back to the huddle. And I go, "Oh, Dad, I think the player X is hurt. This could hurt the team." And he'd go, "Yeah," or he's giving him the Jim Brown. And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Jody, I watched Jim Brown play so many games. He would get up after every single run and look like he was this close to death, that he would just struggle to get back to the huddle, and his teammate would throw his arm around, and they snap the ball in the next play, and he'd run over a 250-pound linebacker." He was playing possum with every other defender in the National Football League. Oh, poor Jim Brown might be hurt until he hits you in the mouth on the next play and knocks you into next week. that he said, not my father. I remember my father saying this, and I'm 8 years old, 9 years old, whatever. So it's funny the things you remember. That Jim Brown was not only a better player than everybody else, but he was a smarter player than everybody else as well.
Yeah, he did. He kind of lulled you into complacency. It's like, we're going to get him this time. And then he ran past you, and that was that. So, or ran over you. But yeah, Earl, I think there's a fascination, John, with the power backs, the guys who could run and plow. I mean, poor Isaiah Robertson, rest his soul. Earl Campbell in the fourth game. It was the fourth game of his career at the Astrodome against the Rams. And Isaiah Robertson was a Pro Bowl linebacker for the Rams multi-times. He's only ever remembered, unfortunately, now for that, when Earl Campbell lowered his head and put it right into his sternum and knocked him about 5 yards back into about 2 or 3 other former Rams and Ram players and so on. And the Rams actually won that game.
Yeah.
That day. But there's that. What do people remember? Earl was something, like I said, these guys who could run you over and at the same time run around you. And that magical game that Earl had against the Dolphins in 1978 when he was a rookie on a Monday night. I'm watching him run up the right sideline, and I could swear the guy's got an angle, and 81 yards later, he's got a touchdown. And and Jim Brown, in some ways, to me, I think was even faster than Earl was. And ran away from you and so on. So, what an error. You don't see a lot of it anymore. Now you see more, guys hitting and bouncing off guys and so on. Bad tackling technique. I'm not going to go through the whole thing with that and so on. But Earl Campbell and Jim Brown embarrassed a few guys.
Yeah. The Earl Campbell, they'd have the rip away jerseys and just people grabbing them. And this entire jersey's gone. He's still going. It was, and I look at the position today, Russell, and it's kind of depressing for those of us. And I say it all the time, to me, the game is not as aesthetic as it once was. And these are the reasons. You don't have the Earl Campbells, the Jim Browns anymore. We got a devalued position at running back. We got everybody running simplified offenses, everybody running the same thing. You don't have as much practice time. There's not these intricate Bill Walsh, masterpiece play calls. It's kind of depressing when
it's a far different game. You're not sneaking out of school whatsoever and so on. The cutback physical time in training camp doesn't allow offensive lines to develop as quickly. There's a lack of physicality. It's probably why that runaway refrigerator in Tennessee named Derrick Henry is able to abuse as many people as he is, because people are just not used to somebody upright like that who is that quick and has a wicked stiff arm and just refuses to go down. He's like think about it. He's really the exception. Who else in this league is even close to even a Derrick Henry, much less that era of Earl Campbell and Walter Payton at the same time with that wicked stiff arm and that relentless running style and so on. So, the game has changed. There is that lack of physicality. The running backs kind of made a comeback last year in terms of production and yards and 100-yard games, but at the same time, you got to do.
And by the way, real quick, Russell, I don't want to disparage the athletes today. They're phenomenal, but the technique, the fundamentals, because there simply isn't as much practice time. You mentioned tackling. I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, they don't even.
No, I don't think you're, John. I'll be honest with you. I don't think you're disparaging the athletes whatsoever. I think it's the evolution or de-evolution of the game and the league that we are seeing this right now. I mean, you're never going to convince me that these guys don't want to hit other people. Okay, they spent their high school and college careers for the most part hitting other people, and now it's for safety's sake and money's sake and so on. That physicality in the league is being de-emphasized. Let's just spread them out and let them catch the ball. And that's why I laugh when I hear people comparing players, especially quarterbacks, the 50s to 60s.
Oh, I saw you over the weekend arguing with some knucklehead about Joe Namath. I don't have a problem. I was telling Jody this last week. I don't have look. You don't have to get into the history of any game if you don't want to, but then
Right.
don't talk about the history. It's a completely different game. Joe Namath is a no-brainer Hall of Famer, but people pull up Pro Football Reference and say, well, so-and-so's got better statistics than Joe Namath.
Right.
Well, you're allowed to play defense that day. You're allowed to get all over the receivers. It's amazing to me.
Well, one of my favorite examples is actually Bradshaw. Okay.
Yeah.
Because Terry threw 2 more touchdown passes than interceptions for his career.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, well, he had a great defense and about, you know what? That was true with the first 2 Super Bowls. Okay. But and this is why I always call the 70 Steelers the best team in the league. I say the Patriots were the greatest dynasty because when you do it for 20 years, 20 years is 20 years.
Yep.
Okay. But when you win 4 Super Bowls in 6 years and do it 2 different ways, that to me showed the greatness of the Steelers. The league, as you guys know, made the major rule changes in 1978. Okay. No more beyond 5 yards with the receiver. Offensive linemen were allowed to extend their arms in terms of pass blocking. I think they moved the hashtags that year and so on. Who won the first 2 Super Bowls throwing the ball for the most part? Pittsburgh, with Swan, Stallworth, Cunningham, Grossman, and Bradshaw, who had it matured by that time and so on. In fact, he was the MVP of the first 2 Super Bowls after the rules changes. Yeah. And again, one of my favorite stats, it just shows you how much the game is different. In 1979, a lot of people know the Steelers were all homegrown that year. Okay. They didn't have anybody who played for them who played for another organization. Guys, they turned over the ball.
By the way, that is amazing.
Ball 52 times during the regular season and led the NFL in scoring.
That's pretty much says it all. Russell Baxter here with us on Birds 365. Quick reference to a guy who was in the news this weekend, A.J. Brown, who almost injured himself in the Eagles Autism Challenge riding a bike this weekend. His phone went down. Luckily, AJ didn't go down, but I used him to make a point. If A.J. Brown was born in 1979 rather than 1999, I guarantee you he would have been a running back. But because the game has changed, A.J. Brown knows that they throw the ball more than they run the ball, and, oh, by the way, they're going to get paid that much more going forward. Oh, he was a man ahead of his time. I guarantee you, with his size, his athletic skills, if he was born 20 years younger, he would have been a running back. That's no longer the case. It's all about the passing game in the NFL.
These bigger kids, I would guess that these bigger kids now with a little speed, maybe wanted to do something else before in football. A lot of them want to be edge rushers now. There's a lot of money in picking up sacks.
Yeah, you got to be pretty big on the edge side. All right, Russell. No, you just put up a post about the needs of the teams in the NFC East. We'll see if you're as bullish on the Eagles as our pal Peter King is, who said a team with no weaknesses. Can't find a weakness on him when he ranked his 32 teams in his MMQB column a couple of weeks ago. Philadelphia Eagles, what needs do they have? What weaknesses do they have?
Well, that inability to stop the run cost them dearly in the Super Bowl. Okay. And it cost them dearly throughout the second half of the season, although they were able to make up for it in a lot of instances. Okay. When you have 70 sacks during the regular season and then 8 more in 2 more playoff games and get none in the Super Bowl against the Chiefs, was the Kansas City offensive line that dominant, or did Andy Reid decide to run the ball at them in the second half?
True.
And which is exactly what happened. The Eagles were tied for 16th in the league in run defense. Okay. So, and when you can't stop the run, this is one thing about the game that's never changed. If you can't stop the run, theoretically, you're not going to be able to stop anything, because then once the team starts play action passing off of you, the receivers are going to be wide open downfield. I mean, the Chiefs pretty much did anything they wanted in the second half because they went to the run and exploited that Eagle run defense. And I think that still is a weakness. I don't know how sound they are at inside linebacker. I know they got Jalen Carter, but they don't have Javon Hargrave. And, this is going to be the 104th season in the league. I'm pretty sure no quarterback has ever thrown a touchdown pass from the sidelines. Okay. And, I think I've looked that up for 103 years. And that's a good way to keep Jalen Hurts and that offense off the field, is by controlling the ball against them. Now, a lot of teams run out of patience. That's the one thing, as you know. Teams run out of patience. They fall behind. But in this league now, where 10-point lead, it used to be you could never blow a 10-point lead in the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Okay. It's now happened 4 times in the last 9 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize
It only
that.
happened twice in the first 48 Super Bowls.
Yeah.
Okay. The Saints came back against the Colts, and Doug Williams and the Redskins came back against the Broncos. That was it. 10-0. We've seen double-digit leads. We saw a 25-point lead disappear in the Super Bowl because the game has changed.
Yeah.
But the one thing that hasn't changed is being able to keep that other team off the field. And the Chiefs were able to do that in the second half. So I disagree that is still a problem for them unless they can prove they can stop the run.
So how do you combat that? Because it goes far beyond Philadelphia, Russell. We were in double digits of teams that ran the Fangio defense last year of the NFL, which basically is designed to limit explosive passing plays. They play light boxes. They're not really overly concerned with stopping the run. And I tell Jody every year, nobody cares about stopping the run until they have to care about stopping the run. When the weather gets bad, late in the season, Northeast, Midwest, some outdoor games. But you can't tackle in training camp. Nobody tackles anymore.
Correct.
Is it just getting better during the season? Is it, how do you do it in today's environment? Because we talked about the physicality, and that's what the running game is.
Yeah, and even the teams that have gaudy rushing numbers, they aren't necessarily physical football teams either. Okay.
Yeah.
Baltimore with Lamar Jackson, and a couple of years ago, they set an NFL record for most rushing yards in the season. Okay. But they're doing a lot of that with the quarterback is not wearing down your defense. Okay. I think that's the biggest problem for the Buffalo Bills. Okay. Is, and they just signed Damian Harris. They brought in Latavius Murray this offseason. But they're not wearing down the opposition. And the more you put your quarterback out there, the more he is prone to turnovers. Josh Allen has not solved his turnover issues. Okay. As close as they've gotten, in the playoffs 4 straight years, they've been to the AFC title game once over that span. He still is very slot. Hell, he dropped the ball on the goal line against the Vikings, which in essence, they wound up losing that game in overtime. So if you're expecting, let's put it this way, if you're expecting Josh Allen to beat Jim Brown, it ain't going to work. Okay. Now, Philadelphia, I will say, has one of the better offensive lines in the league. And I'll be interested to see how they overcome the loss of Isaac Seumalo, who went to Pittsburgh and so on. I know they drafted the kid, and we'll see. They're pretty good at developing offensive linemen. But John, you're spot on, and so are you, Jody. There is not this physicality around the league, and it's funny. I've been watching what Pittsburgh's been doing this offseason. It's almost like Mike Tomlin and Matt Canada and the organization, new GM and so on. It's almost like they're getting ready to play 1960s football. Okay,
I've been waiting for somebody to do it. Yeah. I've been waiting for somebody to look at 250-pound linebackers, Russell, and say, you know what? I'm going to blow these guys off the ball. And
Pittsburgh got rid of all its inside linebackers. Okay, they added Isaac Seumalo. They drafted Broderick Jones. They brought in some hard-hitting special teams players. They brought in Keanu Neal, who can be a linebacker and one of the more physical players in the league. One of these outliers is going to do some damage around the league. And I'm not saying it's Pittsburgh because I want to see him on the field yet, but it's interesting to watch the style of team that they are building right now and how the other 31 teams would have to deal with that if they're going to continue to spread the field. And as you guys alluded to, poor tackling, lack of physical play in training camp and so on. Somebody's going to come in there and like, whoa, are you allowed to do that?
Yeah, we'll see who's got the nerve enough to do it. Pittsburgh's a good team to keep an eye on before the season gets underway with their offseason moves. All right, give me the offseason moves for the three other teams in the NFC East. Off last year, Eagles 14-3. Cowboys were 12-5. Some people think they're the second best team in the NFC. 49ers, Cowboys 2-3. Put them whatever order you so desire. And then you got the Giants and the Commanders. I just looked at the standings. I didn't even realize there's only one game between the Giants and the Commanders last year. And there was that questionable call late in the season game between the Giants and the Commanders that had gone the other way. Maybe the Giants don't even make the playoffs. It seems like the Giants were that much better than the Commanders last year. They really weren't, maybe because they won that playoff game, went into Minnesota and won. Is there a big difference between the Giants and the Commanders coming into this season? If Dallas and Philly are 1-2 and the other two are trying to catch up, is Washington that much further behind? That's the way it seems to me. Maybe I'm not a big Sam Howell fan. Sorry, I think there's a little derivation. Are the Commanders and the Giants both making progress on catching the Eagles?
Well, the Giants first have to prove they can even stay on the field with the Eagles. Okay? I mean, that's a major problem. In fact, the Giants' biggest problem is playing within the division. Okay? I mean, if you count the playoffs last year, they had a winning record and they were 1-5-1 versus their NFC East rivals. Okay? And in all three, except the game at the end of the year where they still managed to lose in week 18 and so on, but they got blown off the ball the other two games. The one at MetLife State was like 48-22 or so on. I mean, that was just that was embarrassing to watch. It was hard to believe they wound up being a playoff team. And I know the Giants won a playoff game, but they played the second worst defense in the league. Minnesota was that whole division for the most part. The NFC North was horrific defensively and so on. But remember that the Giants were 9-7-1. Washington was only a game behind them.
Yeah.
At 8-1. I mean, that nobody in that division had a losing record. Three of the teams made the playoffs. All three teams, by the way, won a playoff game. Okay. So, I mean, that was pretty formidable by the NFC East. But the Giants, they hadn't been in the playoffs since 2016. Their divisional record over the last couple of years has been absolutely horrible. Okay. So they have to prove they can beat Philadelphia and Dallas before they can take any step forward. People have mixed emotions on the Cowboys this year. And I know Dak did not finish strong and so on. And defensively, they were a little erratic. And Dak Prescott's never been a big guy in terms of turnovers. But the last 2 years, he hasn't been as careful with the ball. I don't know if that's because of health concerns or whatever. But I think the thing that keeps Washington down is what you already alluded to, is the uncertainty of a Sam Howell. I mean, are we going to be surprised if he's not their only starting quarterback this year? Because I think, as I wrote in the piece, the last time Washington started a quarterback for all 16 games was Kirk Cousins, and that was 2017, and that was his final year there. So they have been, and listen, Alex Smith was sad what happened to him and so on,
Yeah.
But Ryan Fitzpatrick was in there for about 2 quarters and got hurt a couple of years ago. They haven't been able to keep guys healthy. And they've got some nice, young, exciting talent around them on both sides of the ball. And they went into Philadelphia last year, gutty, and beat the Eagles.
Yeah,
they did.
The only game Jalen Hurts lost until the Super Bowl.
So I mean,
as a starting quarterback.
There's certainly some talent there. I don't think there's any question about it. So I don't think the gap is that big between Washington and the Giants. The only divisional game that the Giants won last year was to beat Washington.
Russell Baxter at Bax Football Guru. Make sure you follow Russell on Twitter. You can read him at Fanside, at NFL, bunch of places. ProFootballGuru.com, NFL Spin Zone. He's all over the place. Last one for me, Russell. I assume you're going to Canton.
Oh, yes.
It's always one of the funnest places to be. for the Hall of Fame induction. Anybody you're looking forward to this year? Jody's excited. You got Joe Klecko and Darrelle Revis for his Jets. Couple Cowboys going in. Eagles fans won't like that. I used to do radio in Cincinnati a bunch, and I've been calling for Ken Riley to be in the Hall of Fame for a very, very long time, and he finally got in. Anybody you're looking forward to in this class?
I think Klecko, to me, really stands out. He's a Pro Bowler at 3 different positions. Defensive end, defensive tackle, nose tackle. Probably one of those over 2 guys. I love the fact that the Hall has expanded the Veterans Committee. That we do get this many guys in. John, you talked about Ken Riley, well overdue. And it's funny because I remember when Paul Krause finally got in. It took him a while.
Oh my God! Yeah, I lived in many. Paul was the mayor of Lakeville, Minnesota when I was out there. But
I was in Hawaii. Those are my ESPN days. So we were able to. We did a lot of stuff with the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Even before we started doing the live telecast of the induction ceremonies, they used to do the tape because the ceremony used to be much, much different. Used to be at 11 o'clock in the morning on the steps of the hall. Now it's at the stadium and all that. But I got a chance to meet Paul Krause, and I think I said to him, finally. I mean, Ken Riley had 65 interceptions. Paul Krause had 81 interceptions and 19 fumble recoveries. That's 100 takeaways, and he wasn't a first ballot. And I think we understand probably why. I think there were probably voters. I can't pin anyone down. Those Vikings Super Bowl losses.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which, of course, were all Paul Krause's fault.
All Paul
Nobody
Krause's
else's.
fault.
But what's funny you say that, Russell, because I believe if they didn't make the Super Bowl, if they say lost like they do now in a bunch of NFC championship games, and he didn't have that on his resume, he would have been, if not first ballot, second, right away, he would have been in just for, think about it. I'll go back to baseball. We know why Pete Rose is not in the Hall of Fame, but he would be. The home run king's in the Hall of Fame. The interception. He's still got the interception record. When the guy he still got it.
Yes.
It
and
is
probably will hang on to it for a long time because you don't see as many interceptions now. Okay. Like I want to say the active leader in the league. I don't even know if he has 40.
Yeah. He's
much less 50 something and so on. But I couldn't understand. Here's the guy who has the most of something, and he's not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. That just exactly to your point, John. How can you have the most of something not be in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah. So, and it all had to do with Super Bowl losses.
We saw a lot of those Viking guys kind of wait and not necessarily be Hall of Fame. But I always look at those Vikings team, and I always point out the fact that they did play 4 Super Bowls and never scored a point in the first half of any of those games.
Wow.
Okay. But I also like to point out this. No team in the 10-year history of the AFL won more games than the Kansas City Chiefs. They lost to them. They played a Dolphins team in the Super Bowl in 73, at least in my opinion, that was better than the undefeated 72 team because they were more seasoned and they were more dominant. They happened to get at the beginning of the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty. Okay. And then a couple of years after that, ran into a very frustrated Oakland Raiders team who couldn't get to the Super Bowl because they couldn't get past Miami and Pittsburgh.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they played 4 really good, great football teams. I mean, hell, the Chiefs, the Chiefs have, when they won Super Bowl 4, 6 of their 11 defensive starters are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. By the way, Jim Marshall's still not in the Hall of Fame.
Jim Marshall's still not in. Eller and I know they campaign for him, and there's been Bud Grant passing away within the last couple of months and so on. There's been a lot of
I tell Jody that story. I think I met Jim Marshall probably when he was 65-ish. So he's probably a senior citizen, Russell. I met him for the first time. I shook his hand. It was like a vice. It was like, to this day, I have never, and this is a 65-year-old man.
Yeah.
I have never, and Adrian Peterson is famous for his handshake. Not even close to 65-year-old Jim Marshall. It was unbelievable. I still wake up with sweats thinking about that handshake.
Well, talk about intimidating. I'll give you this story. We were doing a live shot at the steps at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And my boss, and a guy, gentleman, Jody knows, Bob Rauscher. I was there kind of, I can't remember if I was there on my own dime or whatever, and so on. And because it was very, very early in the early days of my career there and so on. So we're doing a live shot on the steps at ESPN. And Bob says to me, and a production assistant, make sure no one gets in the shot. Okay. So they're doing a live shot and two guys start walking up. And they turned around and looked at me, and it was Gale Sayers and, more significantly, Ray Nitschke. And I look at the production assistant and I said, you tell him.
Smart man, that Russell Baxter. Always has been, always will be. And by the way, have a great time out in Canton when you do go out.
Well, hopefully we can do something before we go out. I go out.
Yeah.
There.
Oh no, we'll definitely get down again before that. But just wanted to mention, I've only been stumping for Joe Klecko for 25 years. I don't actually believe my saying it as many times I said on the air actually got him in. But as you were just discussing, keeping the name in the conversation, others around him, doesn't hurt. And hopefully it made its way through to the Hall of Fame voters, because you're looking about as big a Joe Klecko fan as there is out there. I'm also a fan of Russell Baxter. That's why we ask him to come on. Always appreciate it when he does. Yeah, we'll get you on again before you go out to Canton. Russell, pleasure, buddy. Thanks.
I always enjoy doing this because we get to reminisce and at the same time talk about what's going on in the league. I love the bit. It reminds me of, shameless plug, my page on Facebook, Football Past and Present. We do a lot of modern day stuff, and we do a lot of history stuff. And some of the Hall of Fame voters like Rick Goslin and Clark Judge, John Turney. John Turney is a guy who's not a Hall of Fame voter, but he's the guy who worked together with Pro Football Reference. And that's why you now see the sack numbers for the guys dating back. He's the guy. He's the guy. He's the guy who really put that into motion. And now you see on some of my tweets, I reference blah, blah, blah career sacks since via Pro Football Reference. The NFL isn't necessarily acknowledging them, but Pro Football Reference is. John Turney was the guy who went back and did all the research, media guides, film, all that different stuff to get those accurate sack numbers. So that's why.
By the way, who's number one? Deacon? Deacon's number one, right?
It's Bruce Smith. I mean, Deacon
Bruce?
would tell you, I think they have Deacon at like 173.5. Okay, something like that. Reggie had 198, and Bruce Smith had 200.
Wow. Okay. I thought when they went back, I thought Deacon surpassed them. But
John, the one that's the most interesting, and again, I think the official number is what Michael Strahan and TJ Watt with 22.5.
22, yeah.
Okay.
One season.
But if you go back to Pro Football Reference, I'm just doing this off the top of my head. Al Bubba Baker. From the Lions.
He was a great pass rusher.
Yeah. Well, Pro Football Reference has him with 23 as a rookie.
Wow. As a rookie.
What year was that?
Wow.
1978, I believe.
Okay.
Wow.
So
here's my shameless plug for Pro Football Reference, PFREF on Twitter.
Yeah.
16-game season?
It's the first 16-game season.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. At least he did it on the same number as the guys that held the record thereafter. Russell, we kept you as long as we did. Thank you very much for sticking around as long as you did. You know we're going to get you back. Talk soon, bud.
All right, guys. Have a great day.
Russell Baxter, ProFootballGuru.com, also contributes for Fansided and NFL Spin Zone. All right, Johnny Mac, Jody Mac. We still got that hour to play here, so stick around on Birds 365.